So this is the award, which we do every other year at the conference, and it's to recognize outstanding scholarship in POS, and really to encourage the growth of the field. And as we've seen over time, some of the top journals are publishing work in POS, and so we focus mostly here on empirical work, any type of research method, but again, using some type of data, and published or accepted within the last couple of years since our last award.
Well, it's a great honor to be here today, and Andrew and Roseanne, who are my co-authors on this paper, unfortunately couldn't be here, so I'm here to present what is our joint work. And so this is work on helping behavior. In particularly, we are studying both help seeking and help giving. And so just to give you kind of a summary of what this paper is all about, then I'm sure that all of you in this group knows that helping is extremely important for the functioning of all organizations. However, when we think about the existing literature within this area, it has been focused very much both on the initial point of consent. So do you say yes or no to a helping request? And it has also focused very much on cost, on the fact that helping is costly both for the help seeker and for the help giver, and the exchange relationship between the help seeker and the help giver. So what we do is that we actually studied an organization in which helping was very pervasive, where there was a culture of helping. And what we found was that instead of just thinking about helping behavior as that initial point of consent, that helping is really a process. And we need to study helping behavior as it unfolds throughout this process. And in particularly, that we can think about helping, help giving and help seeking as an organizational routine. And in certain situations, like in the organizations where we study, where people were giving and receiving help all the time. And by thinking about helping as a routine, we also begin to conceptualize helping as a process of joint engagement. So instead of thinking about help seeking and help giving as something that is costly to the organization, it's actually we found a process through which help seekers and help givers become mutually engaged. And this can lead to this positive cycle within the organization where through the actual sharing of knowledge, through helping behavior, people become emotionally engaged, and they're also more willing to help other people in the future. And so this helping behavior in this sense, instead of the way that it has been construed in the literature, actually provides positive outcomes for all the people who are engaged in the process. So that was kind of like the summary of the paper. Now I'll go more into depth in what we actually did. So first, about the existing literature that really thinks about help seeking and help giving as costly. So this literature is really focused on why people would actually give help. And that is, of course, an extremely important question. And in many organizations, that question makes a lot of sense to ask, right? You know, why would I, when I'm very busy with my own work, why would I actually stop the work I'm doing and attend to this other person who's trying to do something completely different? So the literature so far has made great insights into thinking about the situations in which we might give we might actually give help, like the old work on reciprocity, right? If I help you, you'll help me. Or how I perceive the help seeker. So how do I construe that person? Or how have I been helped in the past? Most of this literature is focused primarily on the help giver. So why would the help giver actually do this? Because it seems like a counterintuitive thing to happen in an organization. We then also asked the question about the help seeker. So we began this research also wondering why, what about the perspective of the help seeker? What is their entry point into this situation? And so when you begin to think about situations and think about organizations when helping might actually be pervasive, and there might be a culture of helping within the organization. And there are examples in the literature of such organizations. For example, Hargadan and Becky study this high-tech organization where they show that helping in that organization was actually very pervasive. And you particularly also think about organizations in which tasks are very complex. And so if you're working on tasks that are very complex and highly interdependent, it's likely that you'll actually need help all the time in order to solve whatever you're working on. Think about working on a very complex data programming task where your work intersects with other people. You will have to actually be able to know what they're working on, what you are working on, whether or not those two things are going to be compatible. So this began to raise these questions in our minds about how does helping actually unfold after this initial point of consent, and how might also the recurrence of helping encounters shapes its unfolding. And so when you begin to think about helping behavior as something that happens frequently within an organization, we might actually draw on the literature on organizational routines. We know as organizational scholars that routines are fundamental to organizations, and that when a behavior happens frequently within an organization, it's likely to become routinized. So we might think about, could helping behavior actually also be routinized? In particular, it was a big insight for us when we wrote this paper, when we began to go back to the early literature on routines back in the 90s. For example, Penland and Reuter's study, where how they really construe routines as a series of moves. So when you think about a routine, what that really is a series of moves that get enacted over time. And the different set of moves can then be recombined in various ways to enact the routine. So every time we're enacting the routine, we might enact it slightly different, but we are doing that by enacting these different moves over time. So in a sense, that led us to our basic research question, which was, how does helping behavior unfold in organizations that do innovative work? And our setting was high technology. So we studied an organization, Advantech, that did with, and we studied these hardware and software engineers working on these very complex programming tasks. It was a large organization that had about 30,000 people at the time. And they often encountered problems that they were not able to solve based on their existing knowledge. Our data collection was that we studied 3 teams. Teams were not the focal point of interest for us, but this was how we entered the organization, because we had a relationship with these 3 teams. And each of the teams were geographically distributed, and we collected 3 types of data. Ethnographic data, observations, which was really our main point of data, and the data we're going to draw on most heavily in the paper. But we also did semi-structured interviews and collected archival material on each of the evolution of each of the different teams. And so we did use grounded theory to analyze the data. And in particularly, what we did was, first we identified all of the instances of helping behavior within the organization. And so we found 189 instances of helping behavior. And once we have done this, we began to try to look at, were there specific moves that recurred throughout each of these instances that we could identify across these helping encounters. And so we identified about 28 moves that were recurrent across the different helping behaviors. So that meant that in total we had 2,344 moves that we identify across each of these helping behaviors. So that was about, if you think about 12 moves per helping encounter. And a move could be me, for example, asking a question. What do you think the problem is? Or might this be a problem in the data analysis? Or something, a specific instance like that. And after we had done that, we began to look at these moves and say, were there things that made them common? And we found that particularly interest to us were that there are two different kinds of moves: cognitive engagement moves and emotional engagement moves. So in the cognitive engagement moves was a way that the help seeker or the help giver would cognitively engage the other person in working on the problem. And the emotional engagement moves were the ways in which the help seeker or the help giver try to align or increase the amount of emotional engagement in the task at hand. And so this, I know that this is very small, but just to give you a sense that for each of these different moves, we then were able to group them and figure out, in which particularly part of the routine is it more prevalent, and how frequently does it happen. We also analyzed the context in which the helping encounter happened. So we looked at both the difference between well-defined and ambiguous tasks, the difference between planned meetings versus spontaneous encounters, or versus face-to-face, phone, or email. And so the first thing we did was to identify the ostensive routine. And there we found that overall, if we look at the macro level, we could see that the routine had 4 different subroutines. Establishing mutual attention. In the beginning, you want to attract the attention of the other person. So I'd say, hey, Mark, can you help me with this, for example? Or orienting towards the issue. The help seeker and the help giver had to have a mutual shared attention towards the task at hand. Striving towards a resolution would be them going back and forth, and this could often be quite lengthy, of trying to figure out what was actually going on, what was the problem. And then concluding the encounter would be saying, for example, thank you, I'm so happy that we were able to solve this. I'll see you tomorrow. And so after we had done this, we began to create these visuals that actually map these helping encounters over time, looking at the different moves and the times at which they were enacted, and the change between the help seeker and the help giver, and the use of the cognitive engagement moves and the emotional engagement moves, and how that unfolded over time, just to give you kind of a sense of our data analysis. And so in cognitive engagement, we identified attract attention, which was, can you please help me? Ask a process question. So how should we go about doing this? Should we go to your office? Ask a question related to the issue. So can you tell me more about what this data really signifies? Invoke a representational tool. Look at the screen here. Have a picture. Can you see this is what's going on? Propose a solution. Might this be a problem in the file merge process? So for example would be Olivia saying, so can you tell me what you did? And Jay would say, we have a script, we write a file merge. And so one of the interesting things already here that once we did this, we realized was that when you look at this set and you think about our existing theory, you would think that these would map on very neatly until roles that the help giver had and roles that the help seeker had, right? So it would always be the help seeker who would attract attention. It would always be the help giver who would propose a solution. However, when we look at the data, that is not what we find. We find that over time, the roles become more blurred, and that actually, oftentimes, it is the help seeker herself that proposes a solution to the problem instead of being from the help giver. So these distinctions in the literature between the help seeker and the help giver are actually blurred. We also find there were these emotional engagement moves, as for example, expressing urgency, using humor. And with using humor as people outside the organization, sometimes it was difficult for us to understand their humor because it was very technical, and people would be laughing, and we would be writing field notes, not always getting the joke. Show of excitement. This was very prevalent, right? Showing excitement about the problem and trying to solve that problem. Showing interest. Expressing sympathy for the other person. Showing appreciation. So for example, in this case, John calls up Pamela with a problem, and we only have Pamela's side of the conversation here, and she says, "Hi, John, what's up?" "Oh, don't worry. Tell me the question again." And so Pamela hears, expresses sympathy for John, that this is not, she's going to help him. He can easily begin to explain her the problem, and she'll try her best to help him out in this situation. So after we had found these cognitive engagement moves and emotional engagement moves, we began to look at what role did they actually play in propelling the helping routine forward. And we found that early on in the helping routine, one of the most important things was joint mobilization. So making the help seeker and the help giver jointly mobilized around the problem at hand. Then there was continued engagement. As the helping routine continued, you needed to have a continued engagement in the process. There was overcoming impasses. Sometimes there was things that were problematic. And for example, this was, for example, a place where telling a joke was extremely important, that oftentimes if they were locked down and they couldn't figure out what the solution was going to be, making a joke and expressing humor was extremely powerful in lightening up the situation, reconfiguring the problem, and moving past the impasse. Accelerating engagement, we saw more towards the end, and then preparing for future helping encounters. And so if we look at this, I know it might be difficult to see here on the screen, but we saw that at each of these different phases, there was this recurrent relationship between the cognitive engagement moves and the emotional engagement moves that the help seeker and the help giver would engage in. And I think also particularly important to notice here is this last part, which is preparing for future interactions. So towards the end of the engagement, in a sense, in contrast to existing literature that thinks about helping, help seeking, and help giving as very costly, as a very negative process, we found that there was a lot of excitement and a lot of emotional expressions that had to do with also preparing for the next helping encounter that might happen in the organization. Another thing that we found was that in the literature, help seeking and help giving has primarily been portrayed as a dyadic phenomenon. There is a help seeker that seeks help from the help giver, who then gives help. However, we found that in the organizations that we studied, helping actually often involved more than two people, creating what we call a helping cluster. So what would happen would be that the help seeker would initially come to the help giver. They would work on the problem, trying to strive towards a solution. They might reach an impasse and not being able to figure out the problem. They would then contact a third person, say, maybe Adam can help here, and they would pull Adam in. But importantly, that first help giver would often stay in the interaction because the person had become so engaged. When you think about that scenario in relationship to the existing theory, it would have been difficult to explain, because if this is a question of cost, why would the help giver keep being in the interaction beyond the point in which they've said, I don't have a solution? And also oftentimes we would find that it wasn't actually the help seeker who would ask the third person to help, to come in and help. It would be the help giver who would say, you know what, I actually know that John knows something about this. Let's call him up on the phone. However, why would the help giver use their social capital to engage this third person if this is a matter of reciprocity of an engage, because it was not their problem? So from the point of view of existing theory, those kind of interactions are very difficult to explain. However, if you think about help seeking and help giving as a process of engagement, you begin to think that this scenario makes very much sense, because as the help giver also becomes involved in the process and takes ownership, it becomes as much their problem, and they want to try to find a solution jointly to this problem. So, for example, in this situation from our data, Aaron first takes help from Blake, and Blake and Aaron then decide to ask Axel, and then the three of them are in the office. But none of them, together the three of them, they try, but they can't solve the problem. But then all of a sudden, Aaron remembers that Jeremy did a study that was about improving this process. And so Axel then contacts Jerome and then contacts him up on the phone, and Jerome then helps solve the problem. So again, here it's the help giver who asks for additional help from the fourth person, and together the four of them try to solve the problem. And so I think that this also suggests a lot of really interesting avenues for future research of thinking about what happens when we start to think about help seeking and help giving as a group phenomenon instead of as a dyadic phenomenon. We also looked at these contextual factors, and so we looked at well-defined versus ambiguous tasks. And so well-defined tasks are more similar to those that have been studied in the existing literature, where you might ask your co-author, where is the coffee machine? And they say it's in the room next door. So it's a very well-defined problem. And so we also saw these well-defined problems, and when those unfolded, they look much more similar in a sense to the existing theory, where it has most to do with a yes/no question, and the interactions are extremely short, and there's really not a very long helping process. However, most of the tasks we saw were actually ambiguous, where with an ambiguous task, workers were confronted of this radical uncertainty where they didn't really know what the problem was. They couldn't ask a specific question. They just know that there was something they didn't know. And that thing that they didn't know led them to not be able to proceed with their works. And so working through these ambiguous helping encounters took much longer time and were much more difficult to resolve. However, interestingly, it was these working together on these ambiguous tasks that built much more of a sense of engagement and community and emotional engagement than did the well-defined tasks. Then we also studied when things occurred, like, for example, whether or not helping behaviors occurred in meetings. And meetings were this interesting phenomenon where the helping routine began to be broken down, because in a meeting, you didn't have to engage the other person. They were already there. So a lot of the subroutines were missing when we looked at the helping encounters that unfolded in meetings. And interestingly, interactions in meetings often lacked the emotional engagement that we saw in other situations. And nearly all of the negative emotion that we observed in our data happened during meetings. So oftentimes in meetings, we saw that the helping routine was not propelled forward. It came to a halt, and these helping interactions didn't unfold. It was much more difficult for the workers to enact the helping routine and engage people doing meetings than outside of meetings. And I think, again, that this raises kind of some interesting directions for future research about studying meetings and the roles of meetings in organizations and the emotional engagement or lack thereof, outside meetings, inside meetings, and what can be done to make meetings more engaging. Because as we all know, meetings are an extremely large part of many organizations. And we also studied communication technologies, and there we found that it was very easy for people to engage people face-to-face. Actually, we very rarely saw helping requests being refused. Only in 4% of our instances were helping requests refused face-to-face, whereas in email and over the phone, that was much more of the case. And that was because that over the phone, and particularly over email, workers struggled to enact some of the core elements of the helping routine. It was very difficult to build cognitive and emotional engagement over email. And we also know from the literature that bodily co-presence is a very important part of building emotional and cognitive engagement. And so we saw that as well. And I think that raises, again, some really interesting questions about distributed work. And another reason why it's very difficult to be on a distributed team, and making sure that even in distributed teams that we have enough cognitive and emotional engagement to actually get the job done and work on our tasks. So this is very difficult to see, but this is our overall model. And what I want you to take away from this is just that helping behavior really is a process that goes back and forth between the help seeker and the help giver, that it is a process of interaction, of building engagement. And where we found that the relationship between the cognitive and emotional engagement was that solving the tasks created these feelings of joint engagement, that on the other hand, the emotional engagement widened the attention to the tasks that made the workers also more innovative. So by being in that space of emotional engagement, it also became easier to actually work on these very complex and very innovative tasks. And so what is then the contribution of the paper? Well, instead of, as I've said, the existing literature that has tended to focus on this decision to give or receive help, we focus on helping behavior as this organizational embedded process that unfolds over time. Because we studied this setting in which helping was abundant, we were able to see some aspects of helping behavior that has not been observed in the existing literature. And so first of all, we found that help seeking and help giving was an organizational routine. And that this really departs from this perspective of help seeking and help giving as just an exchange, or as being very costly for the person who engages in this behavior. And if you think about the existing literature, they would say that each helping encounter, in a sense, was enacted anew. And we say that no, every helping encounter is actually a reenactment of some processes and routines that were already in existence in the organization. And so we also contribute by seeing helping as this continual engagement. And here we build on the work on emotional engagement and facilitating group interactions. And so this is just that creativity is just not an element of sharing knowledge, but also of the emotional component that comes from working on these very complicated tasks. And remember that it was really when they were working on the very ambiguous, very complex tasks that we saw the most amount of engagement happening in these interactions. And so this can create this virtuous cycle in organizations where the positive engagement also stimulates future helping behavior that can then diffuse throughout the organization. So there are all of these positive outcomes of helping behavior that we believe have been largely overlooked in the literature. That this is not about a debt, that I owe you something if I've helped you. Instead, it is that if I've helped you, I've built a relationship and a bond and engagement with you. That means that it becomes easier for us to work together in the future. And also that through helping, also the help giver expands her knowledge of the domain area. So it's not just that the help seeker is learning something. Oftentimes, the help giver learned as much in this process. And so this is really how this culture of helping might be created throughout the organization. Then there is this finding about helping as a collective process. that we need to begin to think about that in many organizations, helping does not happen dyadically, but is a collective phenomenon where helping happens in groups. And I think that raises a host of really interesting questions about dynamics and what happens when you already have 3 people working together and the 4th person comes in. How does that 4th person become part of the group? What is the dynamic? How are those relationship builds? How does that unfold differently than if it was at the dyadic level? And because if we think about the existing literature, it's focused a lot about these individual level attributions to I'm helping you now because I have these attributions about who you are, what you've done before, but all of those things are put in a very different light when we think about I'm accepting a request to help a group and not an individual. So I think there's a lot of room for a lot of work to be done in this particular area. And in particular, this thing that I mentioned, that the distinction between the help seeker and the help giver blurred. In some of us longest interactions, if you looked at that data, at the last part of the data, you would not be able to tell who was the help seeker and who was the help giver. Because they did the same, the moves that they enacted were the same. So this assignment of roles into help giver and help seeker, I know we've had to incorporate it into the paper and talk about it in this way, but honestly I think that distinction, and even in the language we use about the help seeker and the help giver, sometimes can log us into thinking about helping behavior in a very specific way that actually does not map the phenomenon that we observe in organizations. And so this opens up some research opportunities. Both, I think, unpacking this relationship between helping behavior, emotional engagement, and innovation. Also, I think it would be really interesting to study the evolution of helping behavior over time and the creation of the helping routine. For example, by studying in an entrepreneurial firm and what happens over time as that entrepreneurial firm grows and begins to develop routines around helping or not helping, or a comparative study between firms that do different things. So you can think about having a multiple case study of, let's say, 6 entrepreneurial firms and following them over time. And I'm sure you'd find that the helping routine and helping behavior, those 6 firms, develop very differently, and we might have some really interesting insights by doing that. As I mentioned, comparing group versus individual settings, and also studying how this culture of helping can actually be maintained and stimulated over time as well, even in an established organization. I think would be very interesting. So at this point in the presentation, I have a confession to make, and that is that I'm actually, this paper is on helping behavior, but most of my work is actually more at the macro level. But I also have some thoughts about how this community might stimulate and spur some, do some really interesting area at a more macro level, or at least outside of the boundaries of the organization, which is where most of my other work lies. So we can think about opportunities to move beyond studying organizations to studying communities, industries, fields, and clusters. So I think that the POS community has developed a lot of tools and insights that could very much contribute to understanding work at this more macro level, what happens outside of the organization, or at the interaction between the external world and the internal world. So for example, thinking about communities, things like Patients Like Me, which is a community of patients that share their thoughts and knowledge about their disease. Like you could become a member of Patients Like Me if you've, for example, been diagnosed with lung cancer, and you become part of the group, online group that of other lung cancer patients. And so here it's interesting, the relationship between patients, the relationship between the patients and the organization that actually runs this community. And also the interaction between being part of the community and the other work that these people do. So you can also think about a community like the POS community. What's the relationship between the interactions at this conference and your work back in your organizations, like how does that translate? What are the positive experiences, the excitement and the engagement you get from being part of this conference that you bring back with you into your organization? How does that influence your life in your organization? Or going a little bit more macro, which is actually where most of my own work lies. I study a lot of the way that new industries emerge, and this is very, very early pre-stage where there really is no industry formed. And doing this in this part of an industry emergence, I see a lot of, I think that studying these parts could really benefit from some of the tools that you have developed. Because during this very early time, a lot of the people who participate during these early industries are there to share knowledge, to be engaged, to be excited. When I interviewed people, why do you participate in these very early pre-commercial groups? Everybody says it's so exciting. I just get so much positive benefit from being here, and it makes me more excited about my job. So I participate in, for example, the Homebrew Computing Club because it's so exciting to be here and think about what could be the potential for developing a new computer. And that makes me more excited about going home in my regular job and working on the engineering tasks that I have. So thinking about how does this excitement of being part of early industries, how does that both help this industry evolve and take off, and what are all the sharing that happens early on, but also how does that affect the lives that people live in in their organizational lives. Or you can think about things like fields. A lot of my own work has been on nanotechnology, studying the emergence of the field of nanotechnology. And early in these fields, you have people from all sorts of different communities come together because they're so excited about what nanotechnology is. So they're scientists, some of them are entrepreneurs, some are lawyers, some are government officials, some just participate in a social movement, and they all go to conferences to discuss what is really the future of nanotechnology. And so bringing kind of some of the positive lens to understanding how do fields evolve, I think would be very impactful, because a lot of this literature also has these focus on the cost and that people enter into new industries and new fields because they want to have a financial gain. That's the majority of the literature would say this is all about financial gain, right? You enter into a new industry because you want to make a lot of money. However, I've found that that is not the case, that most people actually participate because they want to contribute, because they want to be part of something, because they want to be excited about something. And I just think that there's opportunities for all of you to bring some of your knowledge and some of your understandings to this phenomenon. Going even more macro, you can even think about clusters, right? And so the traditional question here has been Silicon Valley versus Boston, my hometown, right? So why come that Silicon Valley is so much more innovative than Boston? Like what drives that? And again, I think here questions around how do people in Silicon Valley think about help giving and sharing and excitement around new technology development versus ideas about what is the cost of this, how can we make money, what are the risks versus what are the opportunities associated with being in a cluster. So even though it's a very macro question, I actually think that that is where some of the real big insights come, is by bringing some of your knowledge into some other questions like these ones. Thank you. Questions.
Yes, we would really like to entertain any and all questions before dessert.
It's not good to be standing between you guys and dessert, I realized.
I actually have a question. Because anyone who knows me knows that I'm very frustrated with social exchange theory, sort of like how you've characterized the current view of
Yeah.
helping. And I wonder, right now you're thinking of the alternative. You specify the alternative as a theory of sort of mutual engagement. I wonder, can you elaborate, past the paper maybe being published, like those of us who are struggling to try to articulate an alternative to social exchange about what happens in connection with other people, do you have more thoughts about how you name it and what inspires how you think about that?
Well, I think it's about, about the fundamental problem with social exchange theory is that it assumes that there is a whole to be shared, right, and things to be given back and forth. And so we need to build, and we're trying to do something in this paper, but definitely it needs more theorization, right, about these relationships about adding, and that the whole is more than the sum of the part, that it's an additive phenomenon where we have more engagement and we have we become more innovative, right?
So it's sort of, what I hear you saying, it's sort of like the way I hear Kim talk about it, it's sort of an assumption about scarcity and resource dividing versus abundance and resource expansion.
And growing resources, right? I mean, in social exchange theory, there's an idea that resources are finite, and that and it's about dividing up those resources or moving them back and forth like they were chips or dollars on a table, instead of thinking about an organic view where we're actually growing the amount of resources available. So the more helping actually happens in an organization, for example, the more the resources become more abundant, right? There's more knowledge, there's more connections in that organization. So resources it's not finite, right? I mean, and it's something that can grow instead of something that is stable.
Thank you. Okay. Ooh, look at this. Okay.
Hi, I just had a question about context. I'm Michelle Williams from Cornell. I had a question about what happens in a context where you're seeing both this kind of generative help giving and the more exchange type. So, for example, nursing, where I have my patients, you have your patients, and sometimes I need just your help with something. I have patient codes, and I just need help. And then there's other situations where the patient's not responding the way I need to, and I'm asking you, how do we solve this problem? How do we work together? So both of those types of exchanges are happening within the same organization, and how do those work together?
Yeah, and I think that in our organization we also saw that, right? We call them the well-defined task, right? Where I just ask you for help. And I think that working together on the more ambiguous task, where we have more of an opportunity to engage and build joint excitement, also facilitates those other exchanges. Because then I am familiar with you, I know you. So when you come and ask me for something, of course I'm going to try to help you because we have that deep relationship. I don't think that those exchanges help build the relationship as much. And I think that it is interesting to study some organizations where, for example, you never have the ambiguous task, so you never have the opportunity to work on those deep problems, and whether or not maybe it is possible also in those settings to actually develop engagement on those more well-defined tasks. It would be interesting to study. We didn't study that. I think it can also be undermining. As we know, there's also a lot of negative things that happen. So, for example, in our case, that happens mostly during these meetings, which for some reason was where we saw a lot of negative energy. Also because it, of course, pulled in everybody from the organization. In the positive changes, there was, of course, a self-selection into who do I ask for help. Also, I might go to somebody I know is a fairly open-minded and broad person, versus there were, especially I'm thinking, on one of the teams, a person who was very negative. and who in these meeting settings often contributed very negatively to the unfolding of the helping routine, often stalling it and leaving a lot of the other people perplexed about how to react to his negativity. And I definitely, and that could definitely undermine this positive spirit of the rest of the team. In this particular team, I'm thinking about what happened was just that this person was often tasked with working on things that he could do on his own, because he didn't enjoy very much collaborating with the rest of the people. So they would assign him tasks that they knew were not as interdependent with the rest of the organization. And so the rest of the team would work on the interdependent task, and they would find a task for him to do that he could sit and work on his own, and he wouldn't have to interact with the rest of the team. That was the workaround they had about, confining this. But I do hear your point about if there's so many little interruptions to your day, doesn't that undermine it? It reminds me a little bit of Leslie Perlow's work, right, where she finds that the interruptions during the day can also have this negative effect on your work productivity. And I think her solution was an interesting one, right, of saying, let's have in a confined period of time in which we can interrupt each other with maybe more tedious tasks and questions, and then we are able to get our work done in another period of the day.
Sally Mickless. Fabulous paper. Really, I liked it before, and I loved your presentation. So my question is just about what you saw or what you believe about the role of time pressure on this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these people were also under a tremendous amount of time pressure to develop. So the organization was developing the next generation of servers. And as you can imagine, there were constantly goals to be met about the performance of the server at different points in time. I think that in this organization, the time pressure, even though you should think that would mean like I'll only work on my own stuff, because if I help somebody else, it's going to deter from me meeting my goal. There was this sense in the organization that if I don't help you, we're working as a group, and you solving this problem over here is just as important as me solving my own task. On time pressure, we didn't really. I'd have to think about it and maybe go back to the data. It wasn't something that jumped at us, no.
So I'm David Bryant. I'm curious to know what advice, I'm really curious about this finding that you had around meetings. Mm-hmm. So what advice would you give to someone based on your findings about meetings? I can see two interpretations. One would be, this is a really good reason not to have meetings, right? Let's kill meetings because they get in the way. But on the other hand, you might interpret your finding as very contextual, that there's something about the routine where they exclude some of those really important triggers to helping behaviors, but they could intentionally incorporate more helping triggers in the meeting so that they become more generative. So I'm just curious what advice you give to the practitioner based on that particular finding.
No, first of all, I'd say I'm personally a skeptic of meetings. Also, some of my other work have also included meetings, and where we also found that meetings was a huge contributor to stress in organizations. That even though when we interviewed people, everybody would say the things that make me stressed out is my email. I get so much email, it fills up my day. But when we really looked at the quantitative data, we found that it was actually not the email, but being in a meeting. But people symbolically attributed their stress to the email because it was more tangible and because it piled up. So the people who really got stressed were the ones who spent all their day in meetings and they came back to their inbox and it was full, versus the people who were not in meetings and were able to, do their email as they came in. So in general, I'm a little bit of a skeptic of. I think many organizations spend too much time on meetings, and I think it's because it serves the purpose of the manager. It's very easy for the manager, but it might not serve the purpose of and be beneficial for the individual worker and the employee in the organization. So that's my first. Okay. My second, I'd say yes. I also think there are things. Of course, we have to have some meetings, and I also think that meetings can be used positively to spur a sense of collaboration and engagement. But it would be, you would have to enact more of the helping routine and try to create more emotional engagement. Maybe bringing up also some collective tasks that were difficult to work on in the meeting. Where people had that opportunity to actually share knowledge and become excited about the complex tasks. Because the thing is that the complex tasks were actually more exciting to people, right? Because that's when they were challenged. And the challenge was exciting to the engineers.
Hi, I'm Rachel Arnett from Harvard Business School. And I was wondering to what extent you think status dynamics play a role in these interactions. Because I could see that when a person goes and asks someone for help, so if I go and ask Lindsay for help, maybe it means that I see her as having a certain level of status that merits me asking her for help. And if she's not able to fulfill that request, then in a way she may feel as though I may have granted her sort of a level of status, and that granting is going to be revoked if I no longer see her as somebody who can help me. So do you think that sort of plays a role? I found myself wondering, like, why do people get so engaged, and to what extent is status and being able to fulfill this request play a role, and is it about, like, one, it feels good to be granted that status, but also there's a certain threat related to if I can't do this, then what does that say about me and my ability to, going forward?
I think it has a lot to do with the culture of the organization. So in this organization, because they were working on such very difficult tasks, it was assumed that most people didn't know. You know, that most of the people you'd ask would not be able to help you because the thing you were asking about was at the cutting edge of whatever you were working on. And so this also meant that there was, in a sense, we think about failure. In your example, I feel it is a little bit like this fear of failure. Like you grant the status, but what happens if I fail? And this was an organization in which it was common to fail, right? That and this also comes with asking for help in the first place. People did not see it as a failure of themselves to ask for help, because it was assumed that, of course, there will be many times throughout your workday where you will not know what to do because the thing you're trying to do is so hard. And so there was little of that sense of failure. And what you would do then was then suggest try to inform somebody else, right? Say, oh, but let's talk to, how can we think about somebody else? Maybe Matt knows, and we'll pull him into the cluster and see if we can solve the problem. I'd say, of course, with the caveat with status, that of course people did go more to the people who they thought would be able to help, right? Or approach certain people more than others in the organization.
And I congratulate you again and your co-authors for doing a terrific job with your paper. Thank you for inviting us all to read it even more thoroughly. Congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.